Okay, we're going to look at section two of the Unit 1 notes. I'm just going to introduce myself and I'm going to move myself off the screen because it's pretty annoying to be on there. So let's just begin. Section two is going to really focus on how the United States and the other allies are going to focus on the rebuilding of Western Europe and what they're going to do with Germany after the war. So one of the first things that's going to happen, and this happened at the Potsdam conferences, Germany was going to be punished in many different ways. The big way we're going to see later is they're going to be divided up, but on the immediate action, one immediate action was going to be they had to pay $23 billion in what are called war reparations, which are basically, you lost the war and now you have to help the the victorious side rebuild. And Germany did not have $23 billion. They were devastated. So machinery, manufacturing plants were dismantled. Many of them were sent back to Moscow, back to Russia, back to the capital. But one of the big things that happens was that the Russians were able to take millions of German POWs and they would use them as forced labor. And many of them just didn't return, and to this date, no one knows what happened to them. The assumption is many of them were worked to death and maybe even executed. The picture down the bottom there is a column of German soldiers heading out of Germany towards Russia. Pretty devastating. The other big thing that's going to happen to Germany is that it did get divided into four zones, and I'll use the mouse pointer here just to show what we already talked about. This was the Russian zone. Okay, the Americans down here, the French over here, and the British. They became known as the Allied Control Council, and their job was to basically govern Germany so they could be punished and they couldn't rise up again. And so they're actually going to rule again. This came out of Potsdam too. Two of the key terms that they focused on were demilitarization and denazification. So we'll talk about demilitarization first. It basically said that Germany was no longer allowed to have a military, and the Allied Control Council would keep order in Germany. There was no need for the Germans to have even a civilian force to take care of themselves. After World War I, Germany was allowed to have a small army to protect itself. That was not the case after World War II. The Allied Control Council, with the four powers military, they would keep an eye on Germany. Denazification, another word, basically meant that no Nazis were allowed to be in any positions of authority in Germany. They couldn't be the mayor of a city. They couldn't run anything. That was part of the punishment, that the leaders of the Nazi Party, and even if you were a member of the Nazi Party, you were no longer able to have any important positions in Germany. The interesting thing about that is decades later, after World War II, a secret program was unveiled that the United States was actually doing, and it was nicknamed Operation Paperclip. Special agents of the U.S. Army went around Germany and they rounded up around 1,600 of the best German scientists, engineers, the experts in the field. One of the things, and I don't know if you got into this last year in your World War II class, but the German army was the first army to have rockets. They were called the V1 and the V2 buzz bombs, where they could be launched. Thousands of them were launched into Great Britain. They weren't really high tech compared to what we have today, but for the time, they were really advanced. So the Americans wanted to get these Nazi scientists and bring them back to the United States to work on our rocket program. The problem was they were Nazis. So some of these former Nazi party members were actually recruited by the U.S. government, and they were sent to the United States to work on our program. We obviously didn't publicize this because the Nazis were supposed to be getting punished. I don't have it in the notes, but an interesting story is the Russians also did the same thing. They rounded up German scientists. The only difference was they weren't offered an opportunity to come to the United States. They had a gun put to their head and basically told them they were going to the Soviet Union and they would work on their missile program. Probably the biggest catch for us in this Operation Paperclip is the man picture here Werner von Braun. He was their top scientist, and he was brought to the United States. You see there, he was called a War Department special employee. This guy was actually so smart and so advanced. He became the flight director or the director of NASA, the flight center that we're going to have, to develop rockets that are going to be able to get us into space and get to the moon first. And many Americans would have been shocked to find out in the 1950s that a former Nazi scientist was actually working on our missile technology. That quote from von Braun down the corner there is interesting. He says, "Science does not have a moral dimension. It's like a knife. If you give it to a surgeon or a murderer, each will use it differently." Basically, what he's saying is a scientist creates something, and it's up to the person who's using it for good or for bad. And he's what he's trying to basically say is he's trying to excuse his behavior. Some of the stuff he made was used in some of the concentration camps and to kill civilians in Great Britain. So Werner von Braun, very smart, advanced, also a little bit controversial. That's why this paperclip was kept a secret. If you get the chance, you don't have to obviously do it at any point, but there's a great video here on Operation Paperclip on the left that you can watch at any time if you want to get a little deeper into it. On the right's our next subject. It's the Nuremberg trials, which is going to be really interesting. Again, here's a good 3-minute overview from the History Channel if you want to take a look at it at some point. But the Nuremberg trials were really interesting. First of all, Nuremberg is a city in Germany, Bavaria to be specific. And it was picked for several reasons to hold these trials. Number one, it was one of the cities that wasn't totally bombed out by the Allies, and it had a big courtroom. It actually had a prison also. The other reason Nuremberg was picked was that was the city where the Nazis had huge propaganda rallies every year with the candles and Hitler making his speeches. So it was kind of like a slap in the face to hold the war crimes tribunal in the city of Nuremberg. So for about a year after the war, these trials went on, and many of the high-ranking Nazi leaders, whether it was military, scientists, the concentration camps, or even those that helped with the economy, were brought in and put on trial. 12 of them were the high-ranking ones, and 22 were the high-ranking ones, and 12 were going to be sentenced to death for their crimes. Some of them were given 20 years. Several were given life in prison. But the key thing about Nuremberg was it set a precedent for future wars that soldiers were going to be held accountable. If they did something during a war that was deemed, a criminal action, they would be held accountable. In previous wars, it was always like, well, I was ordered to do it. So most of these guys who were on trial, they tried to blame Hitler, of course, because at this point, Hitler had already committed suicide and wasn't around. And they would say we were ordered to do it. No one disobeyed Hitler. The tribunal, which was made up of American, British, French, and Russian judges, they didn't go for that. They set the precedent that you can't just say that. The picture down here at the bottom was Hitler's second in command, a man by the name of Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. Also, at one point, the head of secret police. Very powerful man. He was the big catch. He was the big fish that they wanted, and so they put him on trial. He was found guilty also. He was sentenced to death. And they had him under suicide watch. They actually had someone watching him in his cell for 24 hours a day. But Goering was pretty shrewd. He befriended the American officer who was watching him, and he asked the officer, "Could you do me a favor and go down and get some of my personal belongings? I want to write a letter to my wife." So the officer made a huge mistake. He goes down and gives him the pen and the paper to write it. He didn't realize inside of the pen was a hidden compartment with some poison in it. And Goering was able to kill himself the night before his execution. So the morning when he was going to be executed, again, as like the big prize possession, they say he cheated the hangman. He was able to kill himself and not be publicly executed. One of the more fascinating stories of the Nuremberg trials. And just the last thing here is a great quote from Albert Einstein about these trials. I'll just skip to the second part. Criminal actions cannot be excused if committed on government orders. Conscience supersedes the authority of the law in the state. Basically, what Einstein is saying about Nuremberg is that you have to have a conscience. You can't just blindly go and commit these heinous crimes, obviously the Holocaust being number one, and just saying I was ordered to do it. You have to realize it's wrong, and you have to override that and use your conscience. Okay, thank you. That was section 2 of the notes. We'll get on section 3 a little bit later.
So what's that?